Without further ado, the host of Southern California's longest continuously running daily talk program, Larry Mantle.
Thank you, and thank you for coming in on a weekday morning like this. We haven't done this in a long time. I'm so excited to see all of you and to have this opportunity to talk with one of my favorite journalists, Steve Inskeep of Morning Edition. I'm going to introduce him shortly, but I did want to just give you a little bit of a sense of what we're going to be talking about. As I mentioned in that recorded billboard you just heard, Steve has a phenomenal book, which is a very important part of our Southern California history, but we're also going to talk with Steve about his own background, like I'm sure you are. I'm very curious about how he got into journalism, his origin story. We're going to get to some of that as well. So thank you. How many of you, this is your first time visiting our Crawford Family Forum for any event? That's great. Well, we welcome you. We hope that we'll entice you to come back for one of our future programs, either related to one of our shows or to a special event. And of course, we do our special Film Week events at the Theater at Ace Hotel downtown. Our 18th annual Academy Awards preview is coming up Sunday morning, February 2nd. And if you are at all a movie fan, I hope you'll get your tickets and come join us. Well, let me introduce now a man whose voice you know so well because you've heard him for years as the host of Morning Edition for NPR, Steve Inskeep. And let me just take a moment. He's just starting his book tour also, so you're already well-schooled in the ways of
yes.
How many book tours have you done so far?
This is my third. Yeah.
So, and obviously American history, a topic that you love.
Yeah. The first book was about a city in Pakistan, Karachi, Pakistan, called Instant City. And the publisher of that liked the history parts of it so well, she encouraged me to try to do more. And the last two have been American history. Yeah.
That's great. All right. We're going to get started in just about 45 seconds. In radio, everything is down to the second. I have to tell you, it kind of ticks my wife off because I take that time brain home. I don't know if you have this.
Oh, yeah, it totally happens.
She's like, why is it, 10:39 that you say we have to leave to go? No,
yeah.
Why not 10? But it's an
totally
eccentricity from radio. So
it's alarming to watch someone else talk down to the very last second because
yes.
you think you're about to go on, you're about to go on. But of course, when it's me, I don't mind.
You don't have any issue with it.
Yeah.
All right. So we are 12 seconds away.
So what do you think about the...
That's gold. Good morning, it's Air Talk. I'm Larry Mantle. So good to have you with us. We're live in KPCC's Crawford Family Forum. We've invited Air Talk listeners to join us in person for an hour-long conversation with NPR Morning Edition co-host Steve Inskeep. Steve's in Southern California on his book tour for Imperfect Union, How Jessie and John Frémont Mapped the West, Invented Celebrity, and Helped Cause the Civil War. We'll spend considerable time talking about the Frémonts, how their name ended up on streets, mountains, and cities, and we'll also talk with Steve about NPR's political coverage during this intense period and about the logistics of creating NPR's Morning Edition. Steve, welcome back to Air Talk.
Thank you. Glad to be here. This is an intense period, really?
A little bit.
Okay.
You may not be feeling it in D.C.
Well, you get used to it. It's remote and away from events.
It's sort of off the grid. I happened to be at the memorial concert last evening for the great jazz trumpeter and vocalist Jack Sheldon, who recently passed away. And I spent a couple of minutes talking with longtime LA talk show host Doug McIntyre. He recently retired, and after we shared memories of Jack Sheldon, we're talking about the environment that we're in today. And Doug was saying, and one of the reasons he retired when he did was the hyper-partisanship and just how difficult it is for people who are covering what's going on in politics. And, I've told people over this last 3 years, this has been the hardest years of hosting AirTalk in the nearly 35 years I've been hosting the show, because you feel like you're in a pressure cooker with audience response just ready to jump at everything. How has it been for you as a host?
It's been a challenging few years. It's always challenging. It's always partisan, at least in my experience. This is an especially difficult time because things are so divided, and because you have people who see untruth as a political strategy, a little bit more perhaps than in some other times in our history. And when President Trump was elected in 2016, I think it was a hard moment for a lot of journalists. Now, I should clarify that, because some people will say, oh, that's because you're sad your candidate lost or whatever, which is not what I mean at all. What I mean is that someone was elected whose business model was going to be attacking the media. And simultaneously, you had people on the other side who expected the media to take a partisan position and be, virulently opposed to the president. And we want to be doing something else. We want to be doing something different. And it may well be something that some of the people in this room don't entirely agree with. We want to be factual. We want to be straight. We want to be relentless in seeking the truth day after day. We want to be fiercely questioning those who are not telling the truth, but we want to pursue all of those things in a civil and an independent way, going where the facts lead, and recognizing that we won't have all the facts today. We need to come back tomorrow and another day and another day. Did you say you've been doing this 35 years, Larry?
It'll be 35 years April 1st.
35 years.
No fooling, yeah.
No fooling.
Yeah.
That's a good. All right, there we go. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, that, I think, is what is necessary to get at the truth, to keep an open mind day after day after day and keep looking for the facts. I think 35 years is a period where you just begin to get a sense of what's really going on, which is one of the reasons that I've ended up writing history while also continuing to cover the news. I feel that with a book like Imperfect Union that I am pursuing earlier portions of the very same story that I cover day by day. Anyway, it's been a difficult period, but I've come to love and enjoy it in many ways. I have told people who have felt that it's a difficult period, well, it's good that we're here. It's good that we as journalists are here and just to be citizens, to try to keep our fellow citizens informed. And at the beginning, when I told people that, I'm not sure that even I quite believed it. But I've come to believe that it is true and to be glad that I am fortunate to get up really early every morning and learn what I can and do the very best I can and come back tomorrow as a citizen and do it again.
We're talking with NPR Morning Edition co-host Steve Inskeep. It's a special AirTalk Hour live from our Crawford Family Forum at KPCC, and we're so glad to have you with us. We're talking with Steve about his new book as well as about the state of journalism today. I have to say for myself, I feel less President Trump's condemnation of news media, that sort of, because I'm not here to serve him, where I feel more of the pressure, more of the challenges with members of the audience, because people today, so many people, have very fixed views. And
you should have heard them talking about you before the program.
Truth is,
Larry.
I'm sure.
No, that's a joke. That's a joke. Please, go on.
Truth is on their side. And I think I think that's the challenge, is to see where people with a different perspective are and be willing to hear that perspective and to take it in. And that's a challenge for a lot of Americans.
That is really hard, especially today, because passions are running so high. And it is, we're at a point in our history where I think in reality, we as a country still have a great more in common than we have that divides us. But it's hard to perceive that. And I think we've all maybe been in a circumstance, perhaps with our next door neighbor or with our relative, or maybe even your mom, or your kid, and you are completely baffled by their politics and how they could possibly believe what they believe. It is a challenging time, but that's kind of what our job is, right?
It is.
Our job
Yeah.
is to go out and talk with people that maybe we agree with them, but maybe we don't, and to hear those differing points of view. And that doesn't mean, somebody gets to tell a lie and somebody else tells the truth and we just throw up our hands and listen to everybody. We should relentlessly investigate everybody, but we really do want to hear from everybody. We want to hear from and question all sides. And it should be that you should turn on the radio or turn on the app on your phone or talk to your smart speaker, and once in a while a voice should come out of that radio that you really disagree with. That exposes you to a different point of view. And that doesn't mean they will necessarily persuade you. They might. And I hope that as citizens, we can all keep an open mind.
I always love getting those emails from listeners, Steve, where people say, I heard a guest on your show, and I would have never thought that I would agree with someone coming, but there were things I hadn't thought of, or they put it in a way that I'd never considered. I love that, because that, to me, is our job.
Yeah, and even if you don't agree with them, it is smart for you as a citizen to understand the other side's argument a little better.
Well, so the hyperpartisanship of today has nothing on the pre-Civil War era that you begin your story in Imperfect Union, how Jessie and John Frémont mapped the West, invented celebrity, and helped cause the Civil War. So let's talk about the Pathfinder, as he was known, John Frémont. The time when he comes to public attention, first for his map making and his trips to the West. What's the first broader knowledge of John Frémont's journeys?
This would be the early 1840s. John Charles Frémont was the son of an immigrant, an illegitimate son of an immigrant, a French immigrant who fell in love with a Virginia aristocrat, and she was married and did not succeed in getting divorced, but they ran off from Richmond, Virginia to the south. And Frémont was born in Savannah. His father died when he was young. He grew up relatively poor, but he was fiercely ambitious and ended up joining the United States Army Corps of Topographical Engineers. And their job was to essentially map things, to map the American West, the Louisiana Purchase. Initially, their job was not to map California because this was not part of the United States at that time. But Frémont was assigned to go out on these missions. He was eventually known as the Pathfinder. But I want to tell you an important thing about him. He did not find a lot of paths. He did not discover that much that was not already known. This was a region, and we know this, it sometimes has been obscured in our history. There were many, many, many people living in the West. There were whole native nations living throughout what we now see as the West, and there were Mexican settlers as well, and there were white fur trappers who'd been all over the place, but their knowledge had not been codified. Part of his job was to map things like the Oregon Trail, but he had another thing which I think is super modern and super interesting to think about. His patron, who also happened to be his father-in-law, a powerful United States senator, wanted to promote American settlement of the West. Believed that if settlers went out to Oregon, which was then disputed territory, it would become American territory just by the weight of the people who would be living there. And in order to do that, he wanted to promote that settlement. He wanted it to appear, in fact, that the United States government was sponsoring settlers to go west, even though the government wasn't really doing so. And so his son-in-law's job was to go out, have amazing adventures while making his maps, and then come back and write about and promote and publicize his adventures as a way of enticing people to consider making that move down the Oregon Trail.
It's funny, this later on what the U.S. railroads would do to try and boost tourism with these very romanticized stories of the West and discounted fares and all. So long before that, you've got Frémont, and he's writing his official reports in a way to make them of interest to the public?
Yes, absolutely. They read not exactly like a novel, but the descriptions of the Western landscape are quite novelistic. And Frémont did something both as a map maker and as a writer that is really powerful and really interesting for me to think about as a journalist and as a writer. He only mapped things he had seen himself. And so there might be landscape that on the map is just blank. There would then be a line several miles wide through the middle of an area that he had actually traversed or that his men had directly traversed on that expedition. And the rest of it he would leave blank because he didn't know. Other map makers might put rumors of mountains and rumors of rivers, things they'd heard about on the map. He just wouldn't do that. He did the same thing as a writer. He's just describing what he sees and what he experiences day after day after day. And so you're beside the character in this sometimes quite dramatic way, in the way that you would in a Cormac McCarthy novel. But he wasn't doing this entirely by himself.
And that's where Jessie comes in. They get married. She's 17. He's 28, I believe, at the time that they get married. And her father, this Missouri senator, isn't happy about the union.
That's right. They eloped. He was quite angry. He disapproved of the marriage. His favorite daughter was entitled to marry somebody super famous and powerful in Washington. Her other teenage classmates, in a practice that perhaps we would find creepy today, and that I think some people found creepy then, like one of her teenage classmates was married off to the 40-something Russian ambassador. There's a lot of that in this book. It just seems to be really, seems to have been really common then, as I know it still happens now. And I don't mean to say approve or disapprove of it, but Jessie herself was bothered by it. She did, though, meet this somewhat older man and fell in love with him and resolved to marry him. And they seem to have known that her parents would not approve. And so they went and found the nearest clergyman they could. It turned out to be a Catholic priest, even though they were not Catholic. And they married. Her father needed a few weeks to get over this, as did her mother. But in the end, he did. And it is significant he finally placed an advertisement in a Washington, D.C. paper. And the normal way that the advertisement would read, I believe, would be John Charles Frémont marries Jessie Benton, daughter of Senator so-and-so. This said it the other way. Jessie Benton, daughter of Senator Thomas Hart Benton, marries some guy named John. But she promoted his career, and he promoted his career. He had already known then Lieutenant Frémont and understood that this was a guy he could use for his larger purpose of settling and expanding the American West.
And this was not the first sort of mentor that John Frémont had, right? Because I thought even earlier, there'd sort of been people who'd seen his ambition, his drive, and had recognized his potential.
Yeah, there are a lot of fascinating psychological levels to this story. And people who read this will decide if I succeed in bringing them out. But it's an amazing story regardless. Partly psychologically fascinating because it's the story of a marriage, partly fascinating for just what you say. This is a guy who came from a difficult family circumstance, whose father died when he was 5, who was, in many respects, a nobody, who was nevertheless bright and talented, and teachers caught on to him and found him interesting. He had to drop out of school at one point to help help support his mother when he was 13. He was serving subpoenas for a lawyer, but the lawyer was impressed with him and paid some money to get him back into school. He fell in with a French immigrant map maker and explorer named Nicolette, whose name is now in a big mall in Minneapolis, I believe. But in any case, he became a patron of John C. Frémont and taught him a lot of the craft of exploration and of just understanding. Think about trying to figure out what the surface of the Earth looks like when you can't see it from a satellite. You can only see a little bit at a time. There's a whole art to that as well as a science. And so he was a patron, and ultimately Senator Thomas Hart Benton was his biggest patron by far. John Frémont, having lost his father, benefited from a series of what we could think of as father figures.
We'll continue our conversation with NPR Morning Edition co-host Steve Inskeep. We're talking about his book, Imperfect Union, how Jessie and John Frémont mapped the West, invented celebrity, and helped cause the Civil War. more, and we're going to talk in greater detail about Jessie Frémont's central role, not just in promoting her husband, bringing him to wider attention, but actually writing, taking the lead in his writings, which led to his popularity and the importance of his influence, not just in the United States, but in Europe as well. Did you know that there are many species that are named for Frémont because of how he documented it on their travels? We'll continue our conversation in just 1 minute on AirTalk. Okay. From KPCC's Crawford Family Forum, this is a special 1-hour live in-person interview with NPR Morning Edition co-host Steve Inskeep. I'm Larry Mantle. Wonderful to have you with us. We're talking with Steve.
Applaud every time that I.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah.
I think you should just add the track to Morning Edition.
Yeah, we could do that. We could do a little applause
help
track.
us
That'd be good.
get out of bed. Steve Inskeep's book is Imperfect Union on Jessie and John Frémont. As I mentioned in the opening, we're just a few blocks from Fremont Street in Pasadena. There's the Bay Area city of Fremont, where Tesla's factory is located, Tesla Mountain. You have Fremont Street. Even Glitter Gulch in Las Vegas is Fremont Street. So, Steve, let's talk about Jessie Frémont, who, before your book, far less known. What were the multiple hats that she wore in helping her husband in his work and in promoting him?
This is a young woman, and maybe this is oversimplifying it, but you could almost say that she grew up wanting to be a boy. You could certainly say that her father wanted her to be a boy. His first child was a daughter. He wanted the second one to be a son. He was planning to name the son after his own father. Turned out to be a daughter, but he was a stubborn guy, so he named her after his father anyway, Jessie. Changed the spelling slightly. And Jessie wrote in a memoir that my father gave me early the place that a son would have had. She loved him absolutely, and she trailed along when he went hunting in Virginia, and she has anecdotes of carrying the warm bag with the dead birds in it, and she would follow him to his work in the United States Senate, and he would deposit her in the Library of Congress for safekeeping. She would follow him to what we now call the White House to meet various presidents of the United States, beginning with Andrew Jackson, not long after Jackson's inauguration in 1829, when Jessie would have been very small. She wanted to be involved in his work. He educated her in a rigorous way that we would associate in this very different period with the way that boys were educated. He had taught himself various foreign languages and then taught her. And then she became a teenager, and her friends began to be married off, as we were saying before, and she recounted very late in life an experience she had as a teenager. She went to one of these high society Washington weddings where her teenage classmate was being married off to a much older man, and there were all of these youthful bridesmaids and all of these older groomsmen, and she was on the arm of the groomsman, Senator James Buchanan of Pennsylvania, who was 30-some years older, and she found the entire experience to be in some way revolting. She didn't like it. And she says that after that experience, she cut off her hair. And she went to her father and she said, I want to check out of Washington society and I want to live my life as your assistant. And she says this is the moment when her father was no longer okay with her pretending to be a boy, and said it's time to be a woman now, and that men are not going to find you attractive with that short hair, and so grow it back and get with it. She ultimately, as we said, did then marry in a conventional way. She eloped with John C. Frémont, and she then, in the rest of her days, performed the traditional roles of wife and mother. They had, I believe, 5 children. A couple died and 3 made it to adulthood, which was a really common ratio back then. Just an extraordinary difficulty with infant mortality. She did those traditional things while also reaching out for these untraditional roles. She did become, in many ways, her father's assistant, even though he did not accept that as a formal thing that she should do all the time. She also very much became, for her husband, his editor and secretary when he was writing these accounts of his adventures. Occasionally his ghostwriter. He would dictate to her and perhaps change things as he was dictating, even based on the expression on her face. If she was kind of confused, she was the first audience for things he was trying to express. She would sometimes write letters on his behalf. When he was gone out in the frontier someplace, beyond the frontier someplace, she would assume a role as his political representative in Washington. She would write and visit presidents. She would give her opinions to senators twice her age. She would disagree with presidents fiercely. She was very comfortable doing that. And she gradually became known as a political force in her own right, so much so that by the time John C. Frémont, being super famous, ran for president, it was almost as if a husband and wife team were running for president, and she was in the campaign literature too.
One of the things that impressed me, Steve, was her directness as a writer. I mean, it's a period where writing is held up as extremely important, much more so than today, because it is the primary means of garnering a larger audience.
You write on Twitter, Larry. Come on. I mean, that's writing. No, go on.
And it's such a high level that, but her writing is very direct, and not being familiar with her before and reading what's in your book, I understand why she connected with a larger American public. And was there a specific incident or event that led to that higher profile?
There were a couple in which she defended her husband. She was also his publicist. He would write letters that would make their way to her. He would give a letter to an Indian who was heading back east, or put a letter on a ship when he was in California that would eventually get back to the United States. And she would get these letters and she would place them in the newspapers. And there was an occasion in 1844 when he was criticized by one of his superiors in the United States Army. And she was the one who wrote a letter back to her father, the senator in Washington, saying how dumb his superior was. And Senator Benton had the letter published under her name, because Senator Benton was a former newspaper man himself, by the way, and was friends with all the prominent newspaper people who were connected with his Democratic Party. And suddenly there was Jessie's name in the newspaper. And it became something of a controversy. Should a woman be talking about politics? This was a period when women weren't supposed to be in that space. Women found ways to sneak into that space. Women were allowed to speak up for benevolent causes on behalf of the weak who needed support. And through that little window, that little loophole, women were active on behalf of Indians who were being dispossessed of their land, and then became active on behalf of slaves and in the anti-slavery movement. But they weren't supposed to be just straight into politics. And suddenly there's Jessie Benton Frémont doing that. She would also show up at White House receptions, and there would be a newspaper reporter there who would notice that she was conversing in French with the French ambassador, and then suddenly speaking in Spanish with another ambassador, and just being a very impressive and very self-confident person out in public, in the public realm. And it was a really unusual thing.
This is an era where we're not used to couples necessarily talking openly about their feelings toward each other. But do we have much documentation of what Jessie and John thought of each other romantically?
A little bit. There is something very restrained and Victorian about her letters, and something, I think, tragically absent from his. There are a few quotes that survive from letters that don't survive, expressing John Frémont's love for Jessie. There is one extraordinary long letter that Jessie wrote to John when he was out in California that survives, when you get a sense of how achingly in love she was, and how devoted she was to this guy who kept going off to work for months or years at a time somewhere else, and then eventually eventually coming back. But a lot of it is hidden. In 1848, John Frémont went off on one of his expeditions, and she decided to accompany him as far as the frontier, as far as what is now Kansas City, Missouri. And they had a baby who was a sickly baby, and so they brought the baby along. And on the steamboat going across Missouri on the Missouri River, the baby died. And they buried the baby, and a few days later they arrived at what is now Kansas City, and John joined his expedition and went off. Now you could imagine him saying, maybe I should call off this expedition or wait a couple months. It was a very bad time to go anyway. Winter was coming. The timing was terrible. It was actually going to be a disastrous expedition, although he couldn't know that. And he rode off, leaving her behind, and she leaves an account of this that makes it clear that she is completely depressed. She is completely out of her mind. She's going a little crazy in this little cabin where she's spending the night while waiting to get the next steamboat back. And then he appeared in the night, because the first day they'd only made it 10 miles. So in the evening, he rode back 10 miles to spend an hour with her and went back again. Wow. Which is very sweet and romantic. That's one way to look at it. The other way is maybe he could have stayed more than an hour, but that's another. I'll be honest, I'm a spouse. I travel for work. I'm traveling for work now. We have 3 kids, and I think about these things all the time. How do I balance that, and what is right? I feel guilty all the time, and when I can get away with it, I'll find a way to get home a day earlier than I planned. But I relate to John Frémont, but also feel a little critical of him from time to time. Anyway, what I want to tell you, Larry, in this roundabout way, is that Jessie Frémont later wrote a memoir of all the events that I just told you, and for the months afterward. And she never mentions the baby. She never mentions that she had just lost a child. Once you know that, you can see her depression and despair all the way through that memoir. It lasts for months, as you could imagine. But if you don't know that, it would be easy to read the entire book and not quite realize what you're reading.
Steve Inskeep, NPR Morning Edition co-host, joining us on this special live broadcast from the Crawford Family Forum at KPCC. Steve's book is Imperfect Union: How Jessie and John Frémont Mapped the West, Invented Celebrity, and Helped Cause the Civil War. Steve, we should talk next, I think, about how Frémont finds himself at the center of the Mexican-American War and puts himself into an extraordinarily controversial position.
John Charles Frémont first visited California by mistake. Perhaps that's true of some people in this room. He went up the Oregon Trail to what is near what is now Vancouver, Washington, Portland, that area, and then started back. And being an adventurous guy, decided that even though winter was arriving, it's the end of November, he would not go back on the Oregon Trail or wait for the end of winter. He would strike out southeastward across Oregon, unexplored territory, and try to find some new route there. This is a very bad idea to do in Oregon in winter, in a time when there are no roads and you're on horseback. Just had a terrible, terrible time. And they got southward as far as the California-Nevada border. They're not too far from Lake Tahoe. And it becomes apparent they're just not going to find a way eastward that is in any way safe. They are 1,000 miles from Bent's Fort, which is a well-known trading post. All they got to do is make it 1,000 miles across the desert and then over the Rocky Mountains in winter, and they're good. This is not something that could happen, and they ultimately decided that the thing that they needed to do, because they were also running out of food, was somehow cross the Sierra Nevada mountains in winter. Also not a great idea, but that was their best shot, was to go over the Sierra Nevada and come down to the other side. And there was a guy they'd heard of on the trail named Sutter, who had a settlement there, and there were Mexicans there. There would be somebody there that they could buy horses and buy supplies and get some food and, rest up and then try to go back home by another route. And so they slashed over the Sierra Nevada while some of the men were going crazy. They ran out of food. When you run out of food, you begin eating your animals. They ate mules. There were dogs at the beginning of this expedition. There were not dogs at the end of this expedition.
I'm sure the cold was very hard on them.
That wasn't exactly the cold. They ate dogs. And they got over the mountains and descended into the Central Valley and found this kind of wonderland, and found this guy named Sutter, who in some ways was a little like John Frémont, this sort of self-invented wanderer who had somehow gotten a grant for 48,000 acres, which is just a little tiny fraction of this land, right? And had this empire. And it was fascinating to Frémont. And when he left California, he said that he wanted his home to be here. He wanted to come back.
And he had multiple homes here in California, which we'll talk about as we look at the life of the Frémonts with NPR Morning Edition co-host Steve Inskeep joining us on this special live 1-hour broadcast from the Crawford Family Forum. Back in just 2 minutes. From the Crawford Family Forum at KPCC, this is a special live hour of Air Talk with NPR Morning Edition co-host Steve Inskeep. Steve isn't just the familiar voice that you hear regularly on Morning Edition, but he's also best-selling author of a number of books, including his most recent look at American history, Imperfect Union, How Jessie and John Frémont Mapped the West, Invented Celebrity, and Helped Cause the Civil War. It's a story particularly of interest to us here in Southern California. In fact, Jessie Frémont lived out the end of her life in Los Angeles. She lived into the 20th century and died at her house just north of USC. So it gives you a sense of the breadth of the lives of these two individuals. Steve, we were just talking about the Mexican-American War, California ultimately becoming a state, of course, becoming part of the United States, and Frémont's central role in that.
Yeah, John Frémont had an erratic and confused role, but emerged with the reputation as the conqueror of California, which you can do when you have a wife who's a really good publicist. And he went to California, as we said, in early 1844, loved it, wanted to go back, figured out a way to return on his next expedition there, not by mistake, but deliberately, even though it was not a part of the United States. Outfitted an expedition in St. Louis. He would hire civilians to go along with him, even though he was a U.S. Army officer. And so he rode with 60 gunmen into Mexican-controlled California in the winter of 1845, 1846, went over the Sierra Nevadas again, and descended into the Central Valley and made his presence known to Mexican authorities, who were very tense because everybody knew the United States and Mexico, for other reasons, were very near war, but nobody out there in California, beyond the reach of fast communications, knew whether the war had begun or not. But the Mexicans were very tense. So Frémont assured them he was just staying for a little while, and then he was going to head on north to Oregon, which he then didn't do because, well, you see, it's California, and he really wanted to see the beach. And that sounds like a joke. That is literally what he wrote that he wanted to do. He had resolved to make a home there. He would like to bring his mother to California. He'd heard that it was really pretty around Santa Cruz, and so he rode his men down to Santa Cruz and then near the Mexican capital of Monterrey, thereby being near these settlements which he'd agreed to steer clear of. And the Mexicans got upset and confronted him, and that started a chain of events as the Mexicans began pushing against him, pushing against American settlers who had moved to California, and Frémont and the settlers began pushing back, and ultimately a group of settlers took over Sonoma, California, and declared an independent republic, which is known as the Bear Flag Republic, because some guy had stitched a flag with a bear, which is the inspiration for the current state flag.
Yeah, he probably had no idea to have the staying power it did. One of the fascinating aspects of this today is the 150 153rd anniversary of the Treaty of Cahuenga, which took place right across from Universal City. There's a park to commemorate the site right alongside the Hollywood Freeway, the 101, right there across from Universal Studios. Frémont was there, part of that signing, and a Santa Barbara woman, a Californian by the name of Bernarda Ruiz de Rodriguez, convinced him of the way to finding a settlement in this treaty. It was fascinating. And she then actually travels down from Santa Barbara with him to now Universal City for the signing of it. Another woman with a very important role in this whole process.
He wanted a studio tour, I think.
I
was
think
the
that's
reason.
it. Well, KPFK is right across the street.
Oh,
So
there we
that's-
go. You do that as well. Do that as well. No, it's a fascinating story, and I'm glad that I did come for the 153rd anniversary.
Yes,
That's a
yeah.
big. It's
yeah,
a big
we had your
anniversary.
book 3 years earlier, but your book wasn't
Yeah,
done.
it's true. It's true. We had to wait for publication. No, it is an incredibly intricate story. It is in some ways a farce because you have these military forces kind of wandering around California, not really wanting to kill large numbers of the other side, and you have Mexicans who felt a little alienated from their central government, and some of them might have been okay with the United States taking over, but maybe didn't like the way it was being done. And you had Americans who had been in California for a minute and acted like they already owned the place. John C. Frémont, being one of them, acted very entitled and started yelling at the Mexican authorities and naming places and thinking about how he was going to move in with his mom. And it's another country. But they had this conflict, and in the middle of it, United States Navy ships showed up off the coast. In Monterey and in San Francisco and elsewhere. Ultimately.
Sausalito, I think, was one of the places where the ship
You
showed
may
us.
be right. I don't even know that detail myself. But they part of the story of the U.S. Navy Commodore is that he heard of Frémont thrashing around in the interior, figured that Frémont must know that the war was on, so he sent Marines and sailors ashore to raise the flag at Monterey and at the little village that became San Francisco and declared California in the possession of the United States. Then summoned Frémont to find out how he'd known that the war was started, and Frémont said, "What war?" But they knew things were happening. It turned out the war, in fact, had begun. But there was this moment of tremendous confusion when nobody really knew, and still they went ahead and seized California. And possession being, 99 1/100ths of the law in this case, once the United States had seized it under a president who already wanted it, they just weren't ever going to give it back.
And then we have the event set off the court-martial of John C. Frémont. And this sets off a whole saga of pardons, and then he ends up being one of the first two senators from California in 1850.
Yeah,
the saga just is unbelievable.
It's a crazy life. During the war, once U.S. Army and Navy forces had arrived in some greater numbers, there was a dispute between an Army general and a Navy commodore over who was supposed to be really in command in California. The military, like other institutions, tends to be tribal. And John Frémont, as an Army officer, should have just obeyed the Army general in his dispute with the Navy commodore, but he felt loyal to the other guy, refused to take orders from his superior in the Army, and ultimately, yes, was arrested and court-martialed for this. He then was granted clemency by the president, James K. Polk, who understood that he was a hero and he didn't want him in prison or something like that. But Frémont, because he had been found guilty at the court-martial, and because he had not been pardoned, only granted clemency by the president, decided on a point of honor to quit and head off to California on his own not long after that, and to seek his fortune as a private citizen.
He ends up, as I mentioned, Senator of California, but it's fascinating that when he sponsors what's an anti-immigrant bill in Washington that has to do with mining rights and non-citizens being able to profit from mining claims, which had a direct benefit to him, this causes significant problems for him.
Super creepy story. I got an opportunity to write about this in Sunday's Los Angeles Times, and I'm grateful to them for giving space to it. It's a story that I feel says a lot about now. It is one of the early clashes over American identity, who belongs here and who doesn't. John C. Frémont, arriving in California in early 1849 as the gold rush was beginning, had somehow obtained thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of land in California while he was a soldier there, as soldiers tend to do when they're conquering territories, and heard about the gold rush, and then encountered a party of Mexicans who were coming north to seek their fortune. And he said, "Go to my land, prospect there. I think you'll find some gold there." And they went and they did. And without very much effort on his part, they made him rich beyond his imagination. But then, yes, as a United States Senator, a very short time later, he attempted to limit gold prospecting to United States citizens because that's what a lot of the white American miners wanted.
We'll continue our conversation live from our Crawford Family Forum, a special hour of Air Talk with NPR Morning Edition co-host Steve Inskeep. We'll be back in just 1 minute. From KPCC's Crawford Family Forum, you're listening to a special hour of Air Talk with NPR Morning Edition co-host Steve Inskeep. I'm Larry Mantle. Great to have you with us. Steve's new book is Imperfect Union, How Jessie and John Frémont Mapped the West, Invented Celebrity, and Helped Cause the Civil War. I want to fast forward through some of the later period of this extraordinary life of John Frémont so we can ask you some questions about yourself, Steve. But after he doesn't continue after the first term in the Senate, Frémont eventually is the Republican Party's first presidential candidate.
Yes, the Republican Party was founded in the 1850s to oppose slavery, the first major political party that meaningfully opposed the expansion of slavery in the United States. And in 1856, the first presidential election they contested, they were looking for somebody who could unite the party and settled on this super famous, heroic guy who had explored and helped to conquer some of the very lands they wanted to keep clear of slavery. And it was a really raucous, really dirty, really nasty campaign in which more people had voted than ever before. And to me, this 1856 election is a huge story in and of itself that also reflects on now, because people are arguing about race. They were also arguing about immigration. They were arguing about the identity of the country, who could be an American, who could not be an American, what was equality, what was not. And it's an amazing story to me.
So he doesn't win the election, but it does pave the way for Abraham Lincoln 4 years later to become the first Republican president.
This was a time when there was big demographic change in the country. It's the North versus the South. The North's population had been expanding much more rapidly than the South, and Northerners realized they might be able to win a presidential election with Northern votes alone without compromising with Southern slave interests. It is the very thing that Abraham Lincoln did 4 years later to get elected. It is also the very thing that prompted the South to secede from the Union and fire the first shot of the Civil War. They felt they were being permanently shut out of power. That demographic change was really destabilizing there, although it ended up pushing the country in the direction it needed to go.
Later, after the defeat, after Lincoln 4 years later was elected, he names Frémont to be the top official, the western flank of the war. And I understand Ulysses S. Grant, he was his first
His first commanding general, Ulysses S. Grant had been a washed-up soldier who'd left the army but came back, and Frémont gave him a command and sent him around. Frémont, though, did not do very well as a general, quarreled with Abraham Lincoln. There's a great story in which Frémont tried to free the slaves of Missouri. Lincoln thought it was the wrong time, told him not to do it. Frémont refused the president's order or instruction. And ultimately, Jessie, they were in St. Louis. Jessie got on a train from St. Louis and went back to Washington to tell Abraham Lincoln what was what. And it was not a successful meeting. And Jessie, in a letter afterward, says, President Lincoln finally said to her, "You are quite a female politician." And did not like what she had to say, and ultimately he fired her husband, gave him another chance as a general, and he failed again. He was defeated, I think, by Stonewall Jackson in what is now West Virginia. But he had a very unsuccessful Civil War.
And a difficult time afterwards.
Yes.
Tremendous riches, then he loses his fortune.
Yeah.
Ends up dying in New York City, and he was broke at the end.
Yes, but he was lucky in his marriage because Jessie had gradually begun writing, not through him, but under her own name, and in their later years, she wrote memoirs of their experiences, which helped them make an income, and also is part of the reason that we know so much of her perspective of events and of them.
And as I mentioned earlier, she goes on after his death, live in Los Angeles, and dies in the early 20th century at her house just north of USC. Steve, I wanted, in the few minutes we have left, to hear more about your story. What got you into radio journalism?
I first was on the radio at my high school. My high school had a radio station.
That's great.
And I got to be like a disc jockey playing records. Did you know there used to be these things called records? And there were also sporting events. We would do sportscasts, and I got to call football and basketball games. And I had a particular experience in which my school, Carmel High School, was in a regional championship and lost on a last-minute field goal, 17-15. Which my friends who are on the football team are still bitter about it to this day. But I'm proud of it because with my colleague Craig Sheeman, I was able to just kind of call the game straight. And afterward, the general manager of our high school radio station received a call from the guy who called the games for Purdue University, which I followed as a kid. And this guy, Joe Pate, called up and said, I was listening to your broadcast, and I appreciated how they just reported the facts. They called it straight. And that has been an example for me ever since of what I should be doing as a journalist if I do my job the right way. I may have a personal opinion. It doesn't matter. My job as a journalist is to get the facts right that are in front of me, and you can do that even when you have a personal opinion.
And I think one of the things that stands out to me is you can't do this work if you're wired like an activist. People who are political activists tend to be kind of wired that way. Mm-hmm. There's almost an evangelistic vigor to convince other people of what you believe. I sort of see my wiring as more kind of like how a teacher would be wired, where you're amassing information, you're leading people through a story, and the joy is in people coming to their own conclusions.
Absolutely. My parents were both teachers, and I feel that in a way I'm trying to do what they did, learn things and pass them on. And yeah, if you're an activist and all, you're an activist for the truth, or even an activist for doubt, for keeping an open mind, recognizing that everything that I am sure is true about this story today might be overturned by something new that I learned tomorrow.
Yeah, that challenge to be open, to be flexible, and to recognize new information, how it can change a story, is such a critical part of what we do. I find it remarkable in all the years I've been in public radio how we went from, first of all, being this thing no one knew anything about, largely college radio focused, into a boutique kind of a phenomenon, and now into a significant journalistic and media enterprise. It's happened pretty fast.
Record audiences the last few years. It's a very strong organization. It has a growing presence, even as other news organizations have been gutted. They're really powerful local stations like KPCC that have serious newsrooms, even as newspapers have been devastated. It's a huge part of public life, and it's very modern. We have this huge audience for Morning Edition, but there are also millions of people who listen to Up First, and there are people I will encounter who know me first as a podcast host, not a radio guy.
Steve, it's been a pleasure having you with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
NPR Morning Edition co-host Steve Inskeep joining us to talk about his new book, Imperfect Union, How Jessie and John Frémont Mapped the West, Invented Celebrity, and Helped Cause the Civil War. And he will be in conversation tonight at New Road School in Santa Monica with his NPR colleague, All Things Considered host Elsa Chang. More information available on our AirTalk page at kpcc.org. And thanks everybody for joining us this morning live at KPCC's Crawford Family Forum for our special hour-long conversation with Steve. Stay tuned next, Fresh Air with Terry Gross here on 89.3 KPCC. Have a great afternoon.